employed by men and women who risk their lives to bear witness to war. Now, Frontline reporting on Modern Marvels. In March 2003, a military convoy rolled across the desert in Iraq, the first wave of a ground attack by the United States against the regime of Saddam Hussein. But along with soldiers and their weapons of war, the convoy carried civilian correspondents in the vanguard of another revolution. Equipped with satellite phones, video phones, and portable uplinks, these Frontline reporters could transmit the sounds and sights of war in ways never previously employed on a battlefield. Covering war, like waging war, has always depended on speed and flexibility. For the embedded reporters, equipment light and compact enough to keep pace with the troops made it possible to communicate in real time from moving battle zones.
If it was time to leave, it was time to leave, and there would be no waiting around for the TV people to gather all our things. That put us under a little bit of a constriction and a time limitation because we didn't know when they were just going to pick up and leave.
Sam Sambatero was part of a TV crew whose equipment included a portable satellite uplink, which could be set up or disassembled like an umbrella within 20 minutes for live broadcast.
We were able to shoot our video, capture it onto the laptops, edit it if we needed to, and send those compressed files back on the satellites. When our colonel would decide where we were going to overnight, I would set the dish up, find the satellite, get power from the military, and away we would go.
To broadcast even more quickly, TV crews also used a video phone known as the talking head. Its choppy low bandwidth signal could be transmitted by one or two satellite telephones with portable flat-screen antennas.
Hello, John. We're with the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, moving in a convoy that now is paused for the moment, but slowly making our way towards the extreme southeast suburbs of Baghdad.
It wasn't as clear as a satellite image could be, but it was pretty good. And when things started to happen, it was a very live connection to the audience, and many people would remark on that. I felt like I was really there with you.
If I wave my hand here, you'll see quite a bit of delay before it makes it 22,000 miles up to the satellite and back down, where it's being downlinked in France, under the ocean, and up here in New York, and it comes out here.
NBC's David Bloom combined the high-quality transmission of a stationary uplink and the mobility of a video phone with the Bloom-mobile. Its mounted uplink could transmit full bandwidth video in real time, even while traveling at 60 miles an hour.
David's main concern was for him to be able to come live from the battlefield in whatever vehicle he was riding in. While David was moving in a military vehicle, he was able to transmit back to us via microwave, and we were able to uplink.
The Bloom-mobile's key component for transmitting video on the move was its mounted uplink, encased by a dome to control temperature and keep out debris. The uplink maintained its connection to an overhead satellite by pivoting gyroscopically atop a device known as a gimbal mount. Computer-directed movements adjusted its angle as the Bloom-mobile sped across the desert.
It's almost like a hip socket where it's free-floating and is driven by motors that control it so that it can always maintain correct position.
But while innovations like the Bloom-mobile signal a quantum leap in the speed and sophistication of frontline reporting, they are only the latest in a litany of technological innovations which have shaped that profession and our perception of war. And although the tools of the trade keep changing, the historic mission of frontline reporting has remained remarkably constant.
Reporter is doing the same thing he or she has always done, getting the story and communicating it to the people, either by a typewriter or a computer, or now by satellite and voice. But their basic fundamental job is still to get the facts and report them.
Reports from the front lines of war are nearly as old as war itself. For centuries, those chronicles were the exclusive province of military men, usually written long after the fact. The Greek general Thucydides set the standard in the 4th century BC with his 8-volume history of the Peloponnesian War. Julius Caesar's accounts of Roman battles inspired a lineage of soldier scribes that include both Napoleon and his chief adversary, the Duke of Wellington. Dispatches from the Boer War in 1899 helped make the reputation of a young British officer named Winston Churchill.
These kinds of guys were writing their own histories, and of course to the winner goes the spoils, and they were writing history as they would like it to have been written.
Pictures brought another dimension to these accounts. The story of the Battle of Hastings in 1066 was literally woven into the Bayeux tapestry. Later, the invention of the printing press abetted the mass production of war-related etchings. Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre in 1770 helped spark resistance to British rule and fanned the flames of an incipient revolution. With the rise of newspapers and democracy, civilian war correspondents began to appear in the middle of the 19th century. London Times reporter William Howard Russell set the standard for those to follow. Covering the Crimean War in 1854, he revealed that British troops were poorly led and lacked rudimentary medical support. His vivid reports of military ineptitude, including the suicidal charge of the Light Brigade, caused a sensation in London, inspiring Florence Nightingale to lead a nursing service into the field, bringing down the Prime Minister, and selling newspapers by the boxload. Frontline reporting would never be the same.
For the first time, there's a large contradiction and a gap between the official version of things and what somebody who was on site, someone who was there, was actually observing. And that was revolutionary.
In Crimea, Russell wrote with a quill pen and sent his dispatches by horseback, train, or ship. But by the time he arrived to cover the American Civil War in 1861, the logistics of his craft had been transformed by an astonishing invention: the telegraph. A coded electrical signal could travel at nearly the speed of light, and with 50,000 miles of wire set up across the eastern states for that purpose, its primacy was undeniable. As hundreds of reporters flooded the battlefield, eager to scoop the competition, the telegraph altered the style of their work. Since speed was essential, the climax of their stories came first, the beginning of the so-called inverted pyramid style of reporting.
The technology is new. A line could be cut at any moment. You could lose the transmission, and reporters are encouraged to get as much of the most important information, the punchline, if you will, in at the top as they possibly can. And that's really the beginning of the format of news that we have to this day.
The telegraph also helped introduce frontline reporting's historic counterweight: government censorship. The office of President Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, manned all northern telegraph stations and examined each dispatch. Stanton also suspended newspapers and banned correspondence from the front. By 1864, he was issuing his own reports to newspapers in the form of a war diary.
The government was very proactive in trying to influence. I suppose today we would call it spin, but they censored heavily. They put out a lot of releases. They tried to catalog the successes on the battlefield.
Reporters preferred covering battles with easy proximity to a telegraph station, ensuring that campaigns such as those led by General Ulysses Grant, close to the nation's capital, received more coverage than those further afield, such as Sherman's march through Georgia. The reporters were joined at the front by photographers like Matthew Brady, who utilized a wagon as a portable darkroom. Since newspapers of the time lacked the ability to print photographs, Brady exhibited his in urban galleries. His cameras required exposures between 3 and 60 seconds, making action photos impossible. So Brady and others altered still scenes for dramatic effect, placing a rifle beside a corpse and dragging dead bodies to more picturesque locations.
Brady is accused of taking a hand and planting it strategically so that the body or the look of the scene was gruesome enough. And to their minds, they were thinking, well, this actually reflects what happened in this battle.
Newspapers also valued drama over accuracy. As one Chicago Times editor told reporters, telegraph fully all news you can get, and when there is no news, send rumors.
The reporting in the Civil War era, right after the telegraph comes in, is particularly sensational. It's particularly bad. It's not a proud chapter in American journalism. And I think the reason is this feeling of experimentation with the new.
For all that, the Civil War proved conclusively that war was good for business. News of a battle could quintuple a paper's circulation. So in decades to follow, newspapers sent reporters to cover conflicts in far-flung locales, while publishers such as William Randolph Hearst provided enthusiastic support, lobbying for an American entry to the Cuban Revolution in 1897. Hearst sent illustrator Frederick Remington to Havana with these instructions: "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." Once it began, Richard Harding Davis's dramatic account of Teddy Roosevelt's charge up San Juan Hill helped fuel the future president's political career.
There was a swashbuckling quality to the correspondence. They were really the first media celebrities. They loved the role of war correspondents, much as Teddy Roosevelt relished the role of swashbuckling soldier.
The power of the press was able to elevate people to a much larger degree than there is today. The country was smaller, newspapers carried much more weight, the influence was profound, and there was a political agenda in almost all circumstances.
By the close of the 19th century, Frontline reporting reflected both the popularity and the power of the press. In decades to come, 2 world wars and new technology would reveal the range and the limits of that power. The dawn of the 20th century coincided with remarkable advances in communications. The telephone transmitted speech over electric wires, while the wireless conveyed messages over open space. Still cameras could freeze action from 600 yards, while motion picture cameras captured movement. All were in place in 1914, when World War I began, but their uses would be severely constricted on the battlefield.
World War I was basically censored. There was very little contemporaneous coverage of it. Much of the technology was available and might have made for some fascinating coverage of a very, very bloody conflict. Not much of it was seen.
The burgeoning technology of war itself, including machine guns and poison gas, produced an unprecedented carnage that government officials weren't keen to make public. England's War Office refused at first to credential reporters at all. In France, photographers were banned from taking pictures at the front, under penalty of death. Staged photographs and mock newsreel footage of battles were often shown instead. But war correspondents from neutral countries, including at first the United States, had somewhat more free rein. Though most were still banned from the front, American reporters could telegraph dispatches to their readers across the ocean, thanks to another remarkable innovation.
The transatlantic cable made a huge difference because people obviously were able to file stories for the first time that kept the Americans abreast of what was going on thousands of miles away.
Essentially a long-distance telegraph wire, a typical undersea cable was comprised of strands of pure copper wire, insulated by a natural gum called gutta percha, and surrounded by layers of steel wire and jute yarn. By 1914, there were 15 such cables spanning the Atlantic, at a minimum distance of about 1,900 miles. Many of them laid across a gently sloping seabed known as the Atlantic Plateau. Since a cabled dispatch could cost hundreds of dollars, press associations were formed to share expenses.
This led to a widespread dissemination of news as it hadn't really ever been accomplished before.
Once America entered the war in 1917, however, U.S. officials censored heavily as well. Newspapers were required to post a $10,000 bond, which could be confiscated for critical coverage. Major events in the field were ignored. When thousands of American troops were sent from France to Russia in an unsuccessful effort to quell the Bolshevik Revolution, the news went unreported.
If people are not allowed to report the war, you get whatever reporting is available, and mostly that means it's not going to be very good.
The telegraph, the telephone, and the undersea cable all made point-to-point contact. But radio, whose popularity grew rapidly in the years following World War I, could send its signal to millions at once, inspiring the term broadcasting.
Broadcasting was actually a term used in agriculture. It was to spread a seed, to cast it broadly. And it is in World War II that it begins to have that effect on the nation. It's the first national medium.
It was a radio commentator, Edward R. Murrow, whose broadcasts from London during the German air blitz in the fall of 1940 helped tilt American sentiment toward the Allied cause. Once the U.S. entered the war in 1941, thousands of radio and print reporters, cameramen, and photographers merged into the first wave of officially embedded war correspondents. The press wore uniforms, underwent military training, and accompanied troops to battle.
This was a war that needed to have the support at home, and because of that, reporters had much more access in a way that they didn't have before.
We were treated as major grade officers. So we had the use of officers' quarters, officers' communication facilities, personal communication, and that sort of thing.
As the military depended on reporters to tell its stories, reporters often depended on the military to deliver them. After typing copy from behind the front lines, they sent it to press headquarters via military courier. Other methods of delivery in Europe varied with location.
Of course, there is normally no civilian communication facility available. So it was whatever the military made available. From the Navy, that was sent by the Navy radio communications as far as Gibraltar. From the land standpoint, we filed through the Army, and again, the military used their facilities to send our material back.
Motion picture film and photographs were usually processed at military centers as well. Cameras and typewriters remained the standard tools in the field, despite radio's popularity. Shortwave transmissions could be obliterated by storms or sunspots, and were generally unreliable.
Reporters who were broadcasting from the field, from the battlefield, from a war zone had more difficulty and were more prone to weather problems.
Despite the close relationship between the American military and the press, every dispatch was passed through censors before being shipped home. In return, reporters got unprecedented access to briefings and strategy and an up-close view of the war.
Censorship, I thought, was very intelligently handled in England during the war.
In 1943, 8 London-based correspondents, including Walter Cronkite, became the first group of U.S. reporters to fly bombing missions over Germany. Though officially non-combatants, they were taught how to survive in high altitude, how to bail out, and how to fire a .50 caliber machine gun.
Correspondents are supposed to be non-combatants and are not supposed to carry weapons. But the thought was with the Air Force, I think, that if they needed us on a gun, how were the Germans going to know whether we'd been firing a gun or not if we had to bail out of that airplane?
For reporters, there was no lack of danger or courage on the front lines of war. On D-Day in 1944, some parachuted in with typewriters strapped on their backs. Photographers slipped condoms over their film packs to seal out moisture as they waded ashore on Omaha Beach in the midst of enemy fire.
As someone wrote down on the battle landing at Normandy, the brave ones were shooting the enemy and the crazy ones were shooting film.
Reporting wasn't limited to civilians. Photographers like the Army Air Corps' Jerry Cole shot pictures for both military and the public with a K-24 camera he installed in the ball turret of a B-17 bomber.
Being down the ball turret, suspended underneath the B-17, was almost like having your own plane. You could point in any direction you wanted without having to tell the pilot to change course, and it was absolutely fantastic. And of course, knowing that you had 250 caliber machine guns there was also kind of exciting.
Cole also shot photos from the B-17 by sticking his camera out an open window of the plane while traveling at high altitude at 200 miles an hour.
What you do is move into the window like this and go out far enough until you felt the slipstream hit and your camera would sort of go like that, and you just come back about an inch or two and then you could take the pictures. This is the camera now in the shooting position where I have the ball centered in the crosshairs, and you're very fortunate that I'm using a camera, not twin .50 caliber machine guns.
The invention of wire photo and radio photo services boosted the impact of war photography. A photoelectric cell could read a picture as it revolved on a horizontal cylinder, then send that transmission over phone lines or wireless. The result was nationwide photo news. Photographer Joe Rosenthal never saw the iconic image he captured of American soldiers raising the flag during the Battle of Iwo Jima. He simply sent his film to a military press center at Guam, where it was processed and transmitted to the mainland, appearing in hundreds of papers the next day. Published photographs became more graphic as the war progressed. At first, pictures of dead U.S. soldiers were prohibited. In a bid to boost public support for the war effort, however, President Roosevelt lifted those restrictions in 1943.
It was okay to photograph pictures of the corpses of Germans and the Japanese soldiers, but not Americans. And Roosevelt felt that perhaps it was time to show Americans the grisly nature of what American soldiers were undergoing.
World War II would be remembered as the Good War, a conflict in which political and military aims blended seamlessly with the duties of a free press. That harmony would be shattered in conflicts to come. The end of World War II, the Good War, bequeathed the Cold War. That included a series of proxy conflicts backed by the United States and the Soviet Union, and covered by a new mass medium, television. Television was established in 10 million American homes by 1950, when U.S. troops went to war in Korea. But that conflict, which took place on harsh, forbidding terrain, far from major cities, and with few communications links, made timely coverage difficult. Transporting filmed reports could take days, even weeks. Partly as a result, TV coverage was all but absent.
It was called the Forgotten War in part because it was very difficult for reporters to do something with this war and to cover it in the same kinds of ways they could cover other conflicts.
It was very hard to get there. It was hard to get copy back. And it's not clear that the public had much appetite for hearing about it.
Vietnam was another story. As the U.S. military presence grew in the early 1960s, the three major TV networks opened bureaus in Saigon and expanded their nightly newscasts from 15 to 30 minutes.
We did take the war to people's dinner tables. We had film almost every night of battle circumstances. We had several cameramen in the field, and there was scarcely a major action that we didn't have some film on, maybe not the first day, but within the second day.
People thought they were seeing war in real time.
The sense of watching war in real time was an illusion. It took between 2 to 4 days for 16mm film to be shot, flown to New York, processed, and edited for airing. A TV field crew typically consisted of a correspondent and a film cameraman and audio engineer team, literally linked by cables. The cumbersome arrangement could be dangerous when bullets began to fly.
We had two umbilical cables, a short one and a long one. Short one was about 20 feet, long one was 40 feet. If you did get into a firefight, which you're bound to because otherwise you wouldn't be out there, you'd usually use the 40-footer. So if you and your sound man got separated, he was behind one tree. If you're in the jungle, you were behind another. The cable would stretch, hence sound throughout.
Once a battle began, the hefty mouse-eared film camera made an inviting target for enemy troops.
They didn't know what TV is. They didn't know what a camera looked like. All they knew is in a sniper scope that's a weird-looking thing. I know I better shoot that guy.
Military film and still cameramen covered the war in Vietnam as well, often changing reels in the midst of enemy fire.
I just kind of turned my back, crouched down behind something that I knew that would be good cover. Crouch down there, sit down, and take the film out, wrap it quickly into the container, and seal it up, take the new roll out, and load it into the camera, load it properly where it would work right, and all the time doing this, pay attention to what's going on around you.
The cameraman or camerawoman is the most valorous of all of journalists. They've got to be out there in front where the action is, or they don't get the pictures.
For camera operators, maintaining equipment in Vietnam's hot, humid climate was a chore. Wind-up motion picture cameras, which were spring-driven, were often used because battery-operated cameras couldn't survive the heat and moisture of the jungle. The rainy season required special precautions as well.
You had a little terrarium inside your camera if you didn't take good care of it. During the monsoon season, we used the Nikon underwater camera to shoot pictures. We were limited on the lenses, but at least we could take pictures in the rain.
The payoff for enduring Vietnam's harsh conditions was a rare opportunity to report from the front without government restrictions. Officials were reluctant to impose a system of censorship in a war that had never been formally declared, giving correspondents free rein to follow the troops.
We were free to go to a unit, any unit we asked. I don't remember ever being stopped from covering a unit.
Reporters had the run of the battlefield. They could jump on a transport with troops and go anywhere they wanted in Vietnam. And there was that sense of welcoming American reporters to the battlefield, I don't believe has ever been repeated, and I doubt it ever will.
But Frontline reporting's unlimited access led to stories which took issue with official claims of imminent victory, creating an adversarial relationship which reflected growing divisions in the country as a whole.
Reporters attending press conferences in Saigon who had been to battle, because it was an open war zone, they knew they were not telling the truth, or at least the truth that they had seen. And so the conflict came to be called the credibility gap, seemed to get worse and worse.
The power and immediacy of television made its Frontline coverage particularly difficult to refute.
This is what the war in Vietnam is all about.
In 1965, a TV crew led by Morley Safer filmed a group of Marines setting a rural village ablaze. While the film was in transit, Safer's audio report was summarized on the CBS Evening News and promptly denied by the Pentagon. 2 days later, CBS aired the film on television, triggering an uproar at the White House.
Frank Stanton, who's the president of CBS, got a call from Lyndon Johnson the very next morning. And his quote was allegedly something like, "Frank, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to screw me?" But Lyndon Johnson didn't use the word screw because he was a very outspoken Texan.
Despite White House pressure, CBS didn't back down.
We were only writing, even through World War II, just writing about these things. It was easy for the military to deny the story. We didn't have physical evidence. In this case, they suddenly realized they didn't have that defense any longer.
After the Tet Offensive in early 1968, CBS anchorman Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam and filed his own report, concluding that victory was nowhere in sight.
We have been too often disappointed by the optimism of the American leaders, both in Vietnam and Washington, to have faith any longer in the silver linings they find in the darkest clouds.
Watching the news that night, President Johnson told his aides, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." 4 weeks later, he dropped a bombshell of his own.
I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Now, that was the week, apparently, he was making up his decision that he wasn't going to run again. We know that that was the same week that he was besieging the Pentagon, demanding information. How could this thing happen? When you were telling me we were winning the war, had the same question in his heart that I had in mine.
As in Crimea a century before, Frontline reporting of an unpopular war through a popular medium had changed the political landscape.
Lyndon Johnson had enormous political problems with these kinds of eyewitness reports that tell people what's going on.
The Vietnam War would continue for 7 years, but by the time U.S. forces left Saigon amid televised scenes of chaos in 1975, many in the military believed that their open-door policy toward Frontline reporting had been a mistake. It was one they were determined not to repeat. In the wake of Vietnam, government officials strove to exert more control over Frontline reporting. When the U.S. invaded Grenada in 1983, correspondents were kept off the island for 48 hours.
That was a direct result of war coverage in Vietnam. I heard it over and over and over again. Oh, we can't turn this into another Vietnam.
There were many, many lessons attributed to that war. One of them, I believe, from the Pentagon was never give the press an open run again.
But while officials tried to restrict war coverage, the market for that coverage was expanding, a trend underscored by the creation in 1980 of Ted Turner's 24-hour cable news channel, CNN.
Ted Turner's charge to us was to go on the air with the mission of covering news wherever it broke and wherever we could cover it on the entire planet.
They could be on the air faster because they were 24/7. Nobody else in those days was 24/7. No one else was real-time.
CNN's search for live worldwide coverage coincided with the birth of commercial satellite providers like Pan Am Sat, which launched its first satellite into orbit in 1985.
Up until that point, it was all government operators because it costs so much, first of all, to put a satellite up into space, and secondly, it costs quite a bit just to have the ground infrastructures. And the first customer was CNN, Ted Turner.
Commercial satellites are often launched into orbit around the equator, 22,300 miles from the ground. At that distance, a satellite circles the Earth at 17,500 miles per hour, keeping pace with the rotation of the Earth itself. A satellite constellation of approximately 180 such units, spaced 2 degrees apart, provides near global coverage. Companies like Pan Am Sat track their movements from the ground to correct positioning and monitor interference from outside signals.
If you're on Earth, you can always expect that satellite to be in that same relative location. But that requires a little bit of management because the gravitational forces tend to want to pull the satellite in different directions.
Since satellites receive signals which have weakened over long distance, they must amplify those signals before transmitting them back to Earth. They do that by drawing power from the sun.
The one on my left here is called a spinner. It's sort of shaped like a canister, and at any given time, the sun is illuminating one side. So that power charges the batteries on the spacecraft, and that's the power source. This is an HS-601. It's a tri-axis stabilized satellite, and it has 2 solar panels that track the sun. So at all times, the full power is generated on the satellite. So it has the capacity almost twice that of the spinner model.
CNN's financially risky strategy of global satellite coverage began to pay dividends in 1989 during the U.S. invasion of Panama. While credentialed reporters were still largely kept away from the fighting, CNN's round-the-clock coverage of its aftermath redefined television's role.
The more we covered those stories, the higher our profile rose.
Satellite television also helped create a global audience for CNN. That became evident in the buildup before the first Gulf War in 1991, when CNN convinced the Iraqi government to let it set up an exclusive 4-wire phone connection in Baghdad that could send a radio signal to a satellite uplink in Amman, Jordan.
We spent roughly $14,000 a day to keep the 4-wire up. And basically, this simple instrument allowed us to overshoot the telephone exchange complex in Baghdad, government-run and government-owned, and we went by microwave from Baghdad to Amman, to our bureau in Amman, and from Amman up on the satellite, down on the satellite into headquarters in Atlanta, and then back up on the satellites and around the world.
This is an updated version of the famous 4-wire box that we heard a lot about during the first Gulf War with CNN. It gives you an amplified speaker for the people from the U.S. to talk, and you hear out of there, and when you hit a talk button, it amplifies your voice down the 4-wire line so they hear you back in the States. 2-way audio with amplification.
If you're still with us, you can hear the bombs now. They are hitting the center of this city.
When the United States began bombing Baghdad on the night of January 17, 1991, the city's phone system shut down, leaving only the CNN team of Bernard Shaw, John Holloman, and Peter Arnett with the ability to communicate the news, thanks to the 4-wire. They also videotaped the bombing from the 9th floor of their hotel for future broadcast. Millions of citizens around the world and their leaders tuned to CNN to hear their exclusive coverage of a war unfolding around them.
There's a very cool breeze blowing through the window here, and we are sweating in more ways than one.
The situation, the environment, very desperate and very frightening. In war, one moment you're alive, the next moment you're dead. We were quite aware that that could happen at any time. I mean, there were people dying in buildings across the street.
Alone among U.S. networks, CNN continuously broadcast video via satellite from Baghdad in the days that followed. The first television coverage of a war from behind enemy lines, and a vivid demonstration of the growing primacy of satellite reporting.
There were countries that took their national programming off the air and put CNN out in English because that was the most current, important thing that was happening in the world at the time.
And everyone watched CNN. That's basically the only place you could see the coverage. Through that, I think a lot of cable news organizations realized this is a major opportunity and satellites was the way to go.
But for network correspondents stationed in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, satellites still posed logistical problems. The uplink apparatus weighed hundreds of pounds and required hours to set up, making it impractical for transport and giving rise to the phenomenon of rooftop journalism, in which correspondents were all but tethered to their posts.
It would take maybe 3 hours to set all the gear up, take the pieces of the dish, put them together, lock them together, put them on a stand.
Then the camera crews and reporters would have to go out into the field, gather their tape and their stories, bring it back to you, and then we would transmit it.
Correspondents also chafed over government restrictions that kept most of the 1,400 accredited reporters stationed with U.S. forces from accompanying troops into the field. To help fill the gap, the networks often aired footage of airstrikes provided by the Department of Defense.
One of the drawbacks of the initial Gulf War was that you saw it through the lens of a nose camera, of a bomb, or an aircraft. What you didn't see was what happened the moment that bomb or that transmission went to hatch.
It was not freedom to cover what you wanted. You were watched very carefully. We'd have sometimes 3 information officers out with a unit that we were with, and they watched and sat next to the person being interviewed 3 feet away. It wasn't direct censorship. It was indirect.
It almost came to a constitutional violation, the way they kept us from reporting what our troops were doing in action, and by so doing denied to the American people the information which is most essential to them in making their decisions on whether this was the right thing to do or not.
By war's end, many reporters voiced fears that heavy censorship was becoming a permanent impediment to their job. But a return engagement in Iraq 12 years later would mark yet another sea change in the treatment and the technology of frontline reporting. For 2 decades after Vietnam, U.S. policymakers and frontline reporters often viewed each other with suspicion and distrust. But by the mid-1990s, more portable communications tools, coupled with the rise of foreign satellite networks, like Qatar's Al Jazeera, forced the military and the media to re-examine the relationship.
There's only so much that censorship can do anymore because of the technology. You can file a story from a very difficult location that before would have been simply impossible.
The Pentagon is not alone. Something happens in the desert. Al Jazeera spins it one way, the Pentagon spins it the other. They needed a counter to Al Jazeera that was reliable and believable.
Hearkening to the policy of World War II, the Pentagon embedded about 600 correspondents with U.S. troops during Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, while imposing minimal ground rules to protect their security. One result was an unprecedented array of real-time coverage from a surprising source: still photographers. Digital cameras allow photographers to take pictures, examine and edit them on a laptop, and transport them across the globe within minutes. A radical departure from the strictures of the past.
Everyone was working in digital. The whole point of taking digital is being able to transmit those images back in a timely fashion. And you end up taking a lot more than you would if you were just shooting film. This is a basic digital camera, the professional one we use, and I would shoot images on here. At the end of the day, I would take my digital card out, which keep about 400 images on there, and you throw that into a reader on my computer, edit on there, and once I've edited that, I'm going to hook up using this device, which uses radio waves to communicate to satellite over my area.
That's a major advantage, is, you know, shooting digital, seeing your pictures right away, being able to adjust your exposure, you know, knowing that you got the picture, and deciding kind of on the spot what to transmit. 20 minutes after a picture's made, we can have that distributed to publications all over the world.
Another digital tool, the mini disc, allows photographers to record and transmit interviews from the field to augment their pictures.
If Ben's walking around with a mini disc and a microphone, he can both interview his subjects, he can also do personal journals, and then we can create these animated sequences where we're actually stringing pictures together, creating a narrative spine.
This is Ben Lowy in Iraq.
After an initial period of realizing it was some kind of terrorist attack, people started taking positions, and I just grabbed my cameras and started photographing the evacuation of the wounded. When you're surrounded by the members of your unit and they're tight-knit groups, that is your family while you're deployed, and that's a bond of friendship.
If we're taking that still imagery and making video with the audio and the still imagery, we've all of a sudden hit the broadcast space.
Pretty soon it'll just be one person with one camera who will be the talent, the reporter, the producer, and the cameraman, and the editor all at once, because we have the technology to do that.
Smaller and lighter equipment will always be welcome on the front lines of war, ensuring that even state-of-the-art innovations like the Bloom-mobile are fated to become obsolete.
The challenge that we've been issued by Department of Defense is to try and get even smaller, such that our packages, in fact, could mount directly on military vehicles without having to take a civilian vehicle onto the battlefield.
Real-time war coverage has changed the ground rules for networks as well. While broadcasting the advance of U.S. troops toward Baghdad in 2003, CNN imposed a time delay to restrict the potential sudden appearance of gruesome images from the battlefield.
All producers and directors and editors were trained in the use of time delay, a 7-second time delay. Why? Not because we wanted to censor the images, but because the images that might have appeared on air into the households of millions of people around the world, we had absolutely no control over.
For reporters in the field, the physical risks are more immediate. In 2001, more journalists were killed during the war in Afghanistan than were U.S. soldiers. 11 more correspondents, including David Bloom, died within 3 weeks in Iraq.
These were very courageous colleagues, hundreds of them, some of whom did not come back. And that's the ultimate sacrifice in pursuit of free speech.
The misconception among many people is that war correspondents have a very glamorous job. It's not glamorous at all. It's very, very potentially deadly.
There's no shortage of reasons why frontline reporters risk life and limb in the world's most dangerous zones, while bearing witness to extreme displays of heroism and horror.
Career, love of journalism, love of fear, want to push the bubble a little.
It is so exciting, it's so action-packed, and it's noisy, and it's horrible. You see guys getting shot and getting hit, and you take pictures of them for record.
Maybe we can learn from it, so we're not always doomed to repeat it, though we often are. And maybe it's a folly, but it's important to keep that going.
For close to 2 centuries, correspondents have grown ever more dependent on an expanding array of technological devices to deliver the news of distant battles from the front lines of war. For without those means and those media, there would often be no messages.